All right. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ben Levine, a programs coordinator at the Global Taiwan Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event, Taiwan's Global Impact, Reflections from TUPP 2025 Fellows, co-hosted by the German Marshall Fund and GTI. So a little bit about GTI. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to producing insightful, inclusive, and forward-looking research on Taiwan. Our mission is to raise awareness, deepen affinity, and create opportunities to strengthen the relationship between Taiwan and the international community. We do this through a wide range of programs, including our biweekly publication, the Global Taiwan Brief, occasional reports, 3 podcasts, and of course, events like today's public seminar. So now, in the second year of the Lai administration, Taiwan continues to navigate complex regional and global landscapes shaped by geopolitical tensions, disinformation threats, and economic uncertainty. As Taiwan works to strengthen its democratic institutions and global partnerships, building long-term partnerships remains a central priority. We have a great panel here with members from the 2025 TUPP cohort, and we'll include the discussions of how their experiences in Taiwan have impacted their work and the ways in which Taiwan can strengthen its resiliency against authoritarian pressure. So we have 4 outstanding panelists joining us today. Kayla Orta from the Atlantic Council, Julia Mai Kiuk from Port Doma and FP21, Johanna Costigan from the Paulson Institute, and Thomas Koenig from the German Chamber of Industry and Commerce. We'll have time at the end for audience Q&A. Feel free to send us your questions to contact@globaltaiwan.org, post them in the YouTube chat, or tag us on X at Global Taiwan. I'm also honored to be co-moderating today's events today's discussion with Bonnie Glazer, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund. Bonnie is a non-resident fellow with the Lowry Institute in Sydney and a senior associate with the Pacific Forum. She is co-author of U.S.-Taiwan Relations, Will China's Challenge Lead to a Crisis, published by Brookings Press in 2023. Previously, she served as Senior Advisor for Asia and directed the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. With that, I'll turn it over to Bonnie to get started.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, and for those of you who have tuned in, today's event is titled Taiwan's Global Impact Reflections from TUPP 2025 Fellows, but Ben has not yet told you what TUPP stands for, so I will. It is the Taiwan-US-Europe Policy Program, which started off as the Taiwan-US Policy Program, so TUPP. But since I have moved to the German Marshall Fund, which was in April of 2021, because GMF's mission is to strengthen transatlantic partnership, Europe has become an essential part of the TUPP program. So the objectives of TUPP really are to strengthen Taiwan's connectivity with the world by bringing mid-career professionals to Taiwan who are well positioned to include Taiwan in their work. It is a program that I select the participants through an application process. And just to give everybody a heads up, for those of you who might be interested in applying, we will open up the applications in the fall, probably around October 1st. It'll be on the GMF website. And we welcome, again, participants from Europe and the United States. Since 2017, when we launched TUPP, we have held 8 iterations. There was a hiatus of a year during the pandemic. The program consists of 2 components. We begin in Washington, D.C. We spend 3 days learning about Taiwan and preparing everybody to understand better what U.S. and Europe's policies have been toward Taiwan. Because the people who participate are not Taiwan experts, they are experts in other areas. They are experts in health or cyber issues or AI, things where Taiwan can contribute to the world. TUPP covers history, culture, politics, and policy of Taiwan, and cuisine, because we eat a lot of great food. TUPP provides a unique opportunity for emerging leaders from the United States and Europe to gain really the necessary personal experience on the ground in Taiwan to enable them to really appreciate Taiwan's perspectives on the world, on its relations and its role in the world, and on the importance of Taiwan's participation in the world. So that's TUPP. The funders are, in addition to the Global Taiwan Institute, the Henry Luce Foundation and the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, and we're really grateful to all of them for supporting this program. So we are going to now turn to our speakers, and each of them is going to talk about their area of expertise and their experience in Taiwan and their takeaways. And we are going to start with Kayla Orta, who is a non-resident fellow in the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She's also a non-resident fellow at the European Center for North Korean Studies and formerly was a Boren Scholar. And her regional expertise is in U.S. relations with the Republic of Korea, North Korea, U.S. ROK, Japan, trilateral relations, and particularly the intersection of those issues with security and technology policy. So very happy to have you with us, Kayla, to tell us about your experience, and we'll turn over the floor to you to talk about your takeaways and some of the comparisons that you wrote about between Taiwan and South Korea. And I should flag for everyone that we did recently publish, which we publish every year, essays by all of our TUPP participants, the cohort from 2025, and you can find that report on the GTI website. Every one of our experts wrote about their own experiences and the interviews that each of them did separately from the scheduled program. We arranged interviews for each one of them to dig a little bit deeper into their area of expertise with an official or somebody from civil society in Taiwan. So with that, Kayla, over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bonnie, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Ben, and everyone behind the scenes helping to organize this. So this is quite exciting to be able to have some time to reflect back to our time in Taiwan. As Bonnie mentioned, both being in DC and having a bit of a crash course, and then also being on the ground and having that very personal and direct experience. And so I was thinking a little bit, if I were to try to summarize all of my takeaways, we'd be here for quite a while, but I know we have a limited amount of time. So I think for me, as Bonnie kindly mentioned, I am a South Korea specialist, or particularly a Korea specialist by training and trade. So this is where the area I work in, is where I focus on a lot on Northeast Asia. But for me personally, Taiwan has always been, it has been there. The history is there. I understood the knowledge before going for TUPPs, but understanding where Taiwan fits into the larger picture, looking at different industries and sectors was quite interesting. And I think that's where I saw the most comparison to Korea and Taiwan. So of course, because of my background, I came into it a little bit more focused on the question of how do I compare these two? Where does there overlap? Where are there similar histories or diplomatic engagement? But at the same time, I think what was really nice about being there in person is being on the ground, actually having conversations. You don't just maybe link up academic knowledge and comparisons, but you also see what's different, and you see where are their strengths, where are their overlaps, but also where are there diverging paths. And so as Bonnie had kindly mentioned, I focus a lot on the intersection of national policy, security policy, as well as technology. And so for today, I think I'm trying to meld these two and kind of some of my takeaways, but also my interest areas. And I've tentatively titled this presentation as South Korean-Taiwan Relations, Opportunities in Advancing Technology and Energy Sectors. And I will try to watch the time a little bit because I know we have a lot to get into today. But I want to start on an interesting point from the South Korea perspective, bring in some history, and then talk about the two areas that I focused most on the trip, which was the energy security as well as technology policy. And I ended up taking a little bit of a unique direction, talking some space policy. So there will be a plug for the articles. As Bonnie mentioned, we have a really, really great collection, and I really hope everyone goes through and reads. It's a lot of different topics. It's a lot all in one, and it's very fun. So I'm very grateful to join a really wonderful cohort, and I'm hoping people will read them. But I want to start on the South Korea side a little bit here, and that is because South Korea just finished having its presidential election. We have a new person in the presidential seat in Korea, and there's a lot of questions on where things are going to go moving forward. What is South Korea how does the new kind of presidency think of South Korea's role in the Indo-Pacific? And for those of us who are focusing on that area, I think APEC is actually going to be one of the biggest highlights here. And you might think, okay, APEC, Taiwan, what are we talking about here with Korea? But there's something really interesting here. And I don't think many people know that actually South Korea was quite influential and played a very pivotal role in helping to arrange the initial negotiations for Taiwan's entrance into APEC. And so APEC is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and South Korea will be hosting it later this year. And so a lot of attention is on how South Korea will play that hosting role, how there'll be a convening space for other nations in the region, and how they've already historically played a convening space. And so this is a really interesting time to see where the new presidency will take Korea's foreign policy. They very much focus on pragmatic foreign policy leadership. We'll see what this means with this president. But that does open the door for larger conversations and maybe a shift more into the middle or the shift more into engagement in different sectors. And so APEC is something that I've already been watching. And I think many people don't know that history, that South Korea actually played a very interesting role at the time in the early 1990s in supporting Taiwan's ascension into APEC. And of course, APEC covers a variety of topics. And so I won't go into everything there, but I think what's most important is the tagline for this year is building a sustainable tomorrow. And when we think a little bit about what that means from Korea's, branding for this summit in Gyeongju, there's a lot of conversation around not only this being an economic cooperation platform, but also a significant meeting space for global leaders. And we will see a Taiwanese presence in the summit, and we will see them hopefully there in South Korea as they were in the 1990s and as they have been at other APEC summits. Obviously, there is diplomatic limitations, but it's an opening for engagement in the region, and Korea will be playing host to that. So I think that's a very clear, obvious example of how close they are. Another area, and I mentioned I'll have the two other areas on industry specifics. For me personally, what was very interesting about Taiwan being there on the ground was not just only associating TSMC, as we often do with semiconductors, and thinking of Taiwan punching above its weight in that industry, but also thinking about where are there other industries that both represent a national security interest and need, but also an area that South Korea and Taiwan maybe can collaborate on or have some similar histories. And one really good example is on advancing technology, but maybe, as I mentioned before, in a sector that people often don't think about. And in particular for my paper, and I'll do a shameless plug for my paper, I focused on space policy. And I will say this was a little bit new, but I was very inspired to explore. Taiwan is following in very similar footsteps as Korea has in other countries. They established TASA, the Taiwan Space Agency, which follows the same kind of structure as America's NASA and South Korea's CASA. And so there's a lot of interesting movement in that sector that maybe doesn't get noticed because it's still in the beginning phases. And so I won't go into all of the details, but there is a big push for commercial global space industry. There's a recognition that this is growing, this is moving. In some cases, we could argue maybe that Taiwan has a new technology frontier to move into. And there's some conversation in that space, though obviously still kind of new and exploring a little bit on what that looks like. But there's some opportunities here in advancing not only their own technology, developing their own low Earth orbit satellites and communication systems, so a LEO satellite communication network, but then also opportunities for collaboration on international cooperation. I mentioned South Korea's CASA, but also Japan's JAXA. And I think my article tried to articulate not only the trajectory that Taiwan has had that has put it in a position where maybe someday it could play on a more global industry engagement space in this area, but also looking at where there are opportunities for international collaboration in this sector. And so I'll leave that as a bit of a shameless plug. And I do talk a little bit about Europe. I talk about where the US-China competition and concerns about competition and technology competition with China might actually make Taiwan's industry more interesting for particularly our European colleagues who are working in this space. But I'll leave that as a little bit of a teaser. And then the last point that I make, and I am watching the time a little bit, is when we were on the ground, I was very curious because a lot of my background has been on the nuclear security dynamic and particularly security as well as energy sector. And Korea and Taiwan have a very interesting history when looking at nuclear energy industry. So once again, thinking national security interests and needs that transition into industry development. And so this was another area that for me personally, I was quite curious and I was very grateful. And there were a lot of people who were willing to talk about this topic. Obviously, there's a political dynamic to this in Taiwan as well as in South Korea. But we were very grateful from many of our hosts being able to speak a little bit to where does energy security Where's the conversation lie? What's happening? What's moving on this front? Where's the legislation stand? Where has the economic as well as academic engagement been moving? And in particular, I was very grateful for talking with DSET and a few other colleagues at some of the universities and thinking through, is there an opportunity for South Korea and Taiwan to collaborate on advancing their own individual sectors for looking at nuclear waste management and thinking about decommission technology and processes. And South Korea earlier this year passed legislation to establish a high-level radioactive waste management facility. This is very interesting. Both Korea and Taiwan obviously have radioactive nuclear waste because of their time in the nuclear industry. And at the same time, we're also hearing about Taiwan actually closing down its last reactor. And I know there's some conversation about a referendum to restart at some point, but this is a really interesting overlap where even though the scales of magnitude aren't the same between Taiwan's 6 reactors and South Korea's 26 reactors, there is something to be said for learning through the processes at the legal level, but then also at the academic, the industry, the technology, and then thinking about decommission moving forward. So how do you actually go through the process of closing a reactor, organizing the waste management, and then also going through decommissioning and decontamination to allow for a site to be reusable for something else in the future. And Korea is actually also starting this journey, even though they have shut down reactors, they're starting to work through the process of going through decontamination and moving toward decommissioning of the original first reactor in Korea, Kori 1. And so there's some really interesting overlaps in the political, maybe the legislative, the technology, but also in thinking through processes. And so this was one of the other nuggets that I took away from my time in Taiwan, understand a bit deeper on the debates and the curiosities. And then when I left, I think this was an area that to me stuck out as something that will definitely continue in my research and what I do on civil nuclear energy, and then also looking at where there are opportunities for further engagement. And I guess I'll just close, I think, a little bit there. I gave a lot of different ideas. I'm excited to hear my colleagues. And I think for me, these are definitely 2 areas that I'll continue to watch. And I'm in particular going to be focusing a lot on APEC this fall. And I think I finished about a minute in advance, so I think I'm giving back a minute.
All right, well, thank you for those comments, Kayla. We'll now turn to Julia. Julia is a specialist in international AI governance, as well as a research fellow with focused experience in emerging technologies, democracy, and foreign policy. Between Brussels and Washington, D.C., Julia collaborates with leading research institutions, government agencies, and think tanks to develop effective AI governance frameworks that prioritize transparency, accountability, and democratic integrity. Her previous engagements include work at the European Commission Directorate for Research and Innovation, AI Governance and Safety Fellowship at leading institutions across Europe and the US, as well as multiple volunteering projects for UN agencies in Ukraine and Tanzania. So Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben and Bunny. It's lovely to be here today. I'm joining from Brussels, where I work at the intersection of air policy, national security, and democratic governance. So that's my European hat. I'm also wearing the US hat, where I'm a research fellow at FP21, a think tank focused on modern foreign policy. And there I look at how AI is being integrated into US public institutions and wider diplomacy, and what that means for democratic resilience. So the kinds of questions I'm trying to answer in my day-to-day job are, where can AI help our decision-making strategy? But also, where can it introduce new risks, especially in environments dealing with foreign interference and hybrid threats? So that's kind of the lens that I was bringing into the program. And I joined the program because I wanted to understand how Taiwan, which is a high-tech democratic society, is actually governing AI under daily stress to its democratic systems and continuous gray zone attacks. Of course, we all know TSMC and Taiwan's global role in development and production of advanced semiconductors. But what interested me was the governance side of things. So how does Taiwan protect its digital infrastructure and information space while trying to uphold democratic values as well? So in Europe, regulation often takes a center stage when a societal problem needs to be addressed or solved. We often build legal frameworks to define risks, protect individual rights, and assign accountability. And over time, that gives clarity to governments, companies, and citizens alike. So European AI Act, which came into force last year, is one of the world's first binding AI laws. It bans certain harmful uses of AI systems, like behavioral manipulation and social scoring. But it also sets strict rules for high-risk systems like those in critical infrastructure, and it requires transparency in areas like health and education. So this reflects Europe's real strength, turning democratic values like fairness and accountability into actual frameworks and rules and regulations. But the national security angle of that is still catching up. And as we know, AI is a dual-use technology by default. So the AI Act does not cover defense or national security, since those are prerogatives of individual member states. So while we have solid AI regulation on the civil side, the link to broader security policy is still developing. And this gap has been becoming more and more urgent, especially since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We've seen a sharp rise in cyber attacks and disinformation, often accelerated by generative AI. But aligning 27 countries takes time. So that's where I thought we can learn perhaps from Taiwan, a democracy that's already operating under this kind of pressure, and see what kind of valuable lessons we can find there. So when I came to Taiwan, it was quite interesting to see both the parallels, but also the contrasts and how Taiwan is managing its governance. So Taiwan lives with these gray zone attacks or threats pretty much every day. So things like disinformation, cyber intrusions, influence campaigns, many of them powered by AI. That is something that's happening daily and routinely. And I wanted to understand how can we really govern AI and still make use of its benefits when the risks aren't just theoretical, but immediate. And what stood out to me in Taipei is that AI governance, there it's not just about regulation and rules, it's about resilience. That was the central core piece that the AI governance framework was built around. So there are early warning systems to detect disinformation. There is civil tech tools to verify information in real time, and tight coordination loops between government, civil society, and tech platforms. One example that I found quite interesting was a fact-checking platform that crowdsources information verification. So it's fast, transparent, and it's citizen-driven as well. So it doesn't censor anything, but instead it responds by building trust through credible and open communication. Taiwan is also investing in its own AI, which is something that was quite interesting to learn. So Taiwan is investing in its own local language models that are built with high-quality Taiwan-specific data. Which is quite smart, both technically and politically, as it reduces dependencies on foreign platforms and potentially limits some exposure to models that might unknowingly reflect external agendas. And despite different geographies, it was quite interesting to see that Taiwan and Europe are dealing with very similar challenges at the intersection of AI and national security. So in Taiwan, the PRC uses AI-driven tactics to influence elections and sometimes polarize public debates and undermine trusted democratic institutions. And in Europe, Russia is doing a lot of the same. And we see these tactics are evolving when it comes to AI and when AI comes into equation. So now we're seeing things like LLM data poisoning, where state actors try to shape AI systems by feeding them deliberately biased data. So one popular technique that we see quite often is creating multiple copies of websites that repeat and repost the same state-managed information. And then that online data is then being scraped for training AI systems, which learn from this biased inputs. And then if they are left without oversight, they can repeat that as a factual data. So these aren't flashy gray zone operations. They're slow, subtle, and harder to detect. But they are designed to shift what we perceive as normal online, which is quite deeply dangerous in long term for democracies that rely on public trust and institutional legitimacy, even at the age of AI. So that left me with one question, trying to think what can we learn from each other? And I think there's quite a lot of learning that can be done both ways. So I think Europe can learn from Taiwan how to respond to hybrid and gray zone attacks in real time and under pressure, and also how to embed civic tech and wider society into AI governance. And from Europe, Taiwan can potentially draw on how to build codified systems, things like algorithmic transparency and wider AI governance and accountability frameworks. And these are not necessarily competing models, they're entirely complementary the way I see them. So European model can bring structure and scale, and Taiwan can bring speed and adaptability, and putting those two together, these two systems can form a beginning of democratic playbook for governing AI effectively, while also allowing us to harness the benefits that this technology brings. So we're already seeing some seeds of developing dialogue, whether it's TSMC investment in Germany or joint work on cyber resilience. But we can probably go one step further to have a wider discussion on shared pilot projects in AI and digital space, as well as deeper knowledge exchange. And that's what makes programs like this so valuable. They help us break out of policy silos and start thinking strategically across regions, systems, and ways of governing. And this is something that I found particularly enlightening. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and a further discussion and hearing my colleagues as well.
Thank you, Julia. Next, we're going to turn to Johanna Costigan, who is Associate Director of Research at the Paulson Institute in Washington, D.C. And in this role, she supports the Executive Director in diversifying the Paulson Institute's efforts across a range of issues, including biodiversity, green finance, and conservation. And she also manages engagement initiatives and research projects, including working with the Paulson Institute's external partners and counterparts. And she's going to talk to us about TSMC and semiconductor production, which is, of course, a very hot issue, with TSMC expanding its pledge to the United States, building now up to it will be eventually 6 fabs in the United States, and $165 billion already pledged. So I'll give the floor, Johanna, to tell us about your experience in Taiwan and about TSMC and where the global semiconductor production situation is.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. You already took some of my stats, so thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, so in addition to what Bonnie said, my background is also in China policy, specifically industrial and technology policy. And I've actually done quite a bit of research on China's emerging artificial intelligence regulations, which I had the opportunity to talk about with Julia, which was great. So congrats to TUPP on the transatlantic partnership fostering. So coming from a China background, going to Taiwan, I was kind of immediately interested in looking at how Taiwan handles industrial policy. And there's a very immediate contrast that's often made within the China field about how China can make long-term planning and policy while the US has to operate in the inconvenient 4-year election cycles that don't necessarily allow for the kind of long-term investment and planning that we've seen China pursue over these 4+ decades of reform and opening up. So looking at Taiwan, it's obviously a different governance structure. It's a democracy. It responds to market forces, and it also has really successful industrial policy. So it sort of shows that that contrast isn't necessarily so either or, which was great to learn more about within the example of TSMC, but also beyond it. And contrary to my assumption, actually, our interlocutors in Taiwan brought up TSMC readily and eagerly in a lot of our meetings without necessarily always being prompted. They discussed its overlap with security policy and foreign policy, also domestic party politics, which we learned a lot about, and also energy policy, which our colleague Natalie wrote about in the much touted compendium that everyone should read. So there was no need for me or anyone to overly prompt the people that we were speaking with to talk about TSMC's outsized or possibly totally proportionate role in Taiwan's economy and global reputation. Everyone was eager to do so. And also to shed some light on the context in which TSMC has succeeded. It was largely supported by industrial policy, including the founding or during its founding, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, ITRI, in Taiwan, some support and helped the founder, Morris Chang, really develop his pure play foundry model that has enabled TSMC's economic success. And there's also other industrial policy in Taiwan that supports the whole ecosystem, including science park development, funding for talent development, and just a strong focus on education and talent fostering that we learned about explicitly. And we also learned how that is possibly going to be expanding in a more direct way to cultivating AI talent and really working on creating a TSMC for AI or for software is a burgeoning plan in Taiwan. So thinking about the way that industrial policy does not necessarily have to thrive in a non-democratic environment, and I'm sure our European colleagues can say more about that. I was really thinking about the possibly excessive contrast and the fact that in Taiwan, you have both a really thriving and at least somewhat naturally developed semiconductor and hardware supply chain and market that really plugged into the globalization and global economy that we've all sort of collectively been fostering for the last 30 years or so. And today, to be speaking recently, our trip was in February, to our interlocutors in Taiwan, there was sort of a deviation from that status quo that is being partly epitomized by the Trump administration, where the somewhat happy globalization, one of our interlocutors described Taiwanese companies as the foot soldiers of globalization, that is being threatened a little bit by the economic and foreign policy coming from the United States and other isolationist trends elsewhere. So what does that mean for Taiwan? And how does that affect the historical rhetorical emphasis that the US-Taiwan relationship has enjoyed that is focused on how both our democracies, both have similar values, and both have market-driven economies, that now maybe the US is not as completely in agreement with the importance of supporting those democratic values. Perhaps that's why TSMC featured so heavily in our conversations with our Taiwanese interlocutors as a sort of pivot away from a rhetorical democracy values-based orientation and towards the type of practical deal making that our president seems to enjoy touting so much. And one thing became very, very clear, I think to all of us, which is while that practical and tough talk might be somewhat effective in pressuring Taiwan to continue its expansion in foreign direct investment to the US with TSMC's record-setting $165 billion investment into Arizona. There's a real logistical problem with it, which is the fact that Taiwan's hardware supply chain cannot simply just be exported, not with the waving of a magic wand, but also not with anything short of extremely patient and consistent industrial policy and a very welcoming environment here in the US, which is not something that any administration, and certainly not the Trump administration, can promise. So learning more details about that supply chain, including the fact that it's not just TSMC, it's a larger hardware ecosystem in Taiwan that really thrives. On the upstream level, there's the chip design, and then in the midstream is where TSMC lives in fabrication. And then there's also the downstream elements like packaging and testing and other components, all of which are readily available in Taiwan, which is a conveniently small island. We learned by taking the high-speed rail from the northernmost city to basically the southernmost major city. So I think that making US policymakers really understand the difficulty in exporting that supply chain is critical. And it might be a little bit counterintuitive to pursue in tandem with TSMC's record-setting investment in the US. But I think in a way, it sort of shows TSMC is making a very, very strong goodwill gesture. And I think a good amount of production they are planning to do here, to actually pull off here in Arizona. But that doesn't necessarily mean, and in my opinion, it certainly does not mean that Taiwan Island becomes obsolete in terms of advanced semiconductor manufacturing. It's pretty critical that our policymakers understand that we need Taiwan, not just Taiwan's crown jewel company. So I think CC Wei, the chairman and CEO of TSMC, last week made that gesture of goodwill very clear, talking about how the second fab in Arizona has finished completion. The third one's already underway. The chips that will be made here in the US are quite advanced, more so than we initially thought. So all of that is very good. And, you know, from the Washington perspective, signifies a win. As one of our interlocutors told us in DC, I'm not really sure why the Trump administration is putting so much pressure on TSMC when they're already getting what they want, right? So it's not clear to me why the pressure campaign, which includes tariffs and other punitive measures and call-outs, I'm not really sure what the end game is there for the Trump administration. But I think it's up to us, people who can potentially give some advice to policymakers who might have some open ears, to say, this is the reality of the supply chain. This is why it cannot simply be exported to Arizona. And that if we really want a secure, advanced semiconductor supply chain, then we need to secure Taiwan, not mine it of its talent and of its manufacturing capacity. So with that, I will give my time to the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Johanna, for those remarks. So now we're going to move on to Thomas Koenig. Thomas is the Director China at the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry, co-author of the book How to Manage China, now in its third edition, and China, Mastering Business in Everyday Life. He's concurrently a McCloy Fellow on Global Trends at the American Council on Germany and has a teaching position at the Technical University Berlin in the winter semester 24-25. Thomas has many years of experience in China, including at the world's largest German Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, which serves over 1,600 member companies. He studied at Yale, LSE, and SOAS with an English Chinese semester at Peking University, and worked at the European Council on Foreign Relations in London and Paris. He has developed training programs for the future Chinese UN diplomats at the United Nations Institute of Training and Research in Geneva, and he was voted one of the top 100 decision makers in German-Chinese relations by Table Media Professionals Briefings in 2024. So Thomas, over to you for your remarks.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you so much, Bonnie, as well. Just to start off, I just want to reiterate how much I love TUPP, and I think it was a quite life-changing experience. So I can just only encourage, especially the Europeans who might be listening and watching, to apply, because in Europe we don't really have that tradition of doing amazing fellowship programs. So we should really make use of those. So I can only encourage people, please apply. And that kind of brings me as well to, my whole thinking about Taiwan has been enriched through that program. As Ben kindly mentioned in my introduction, I have been thinking and talking to mainland China for more than 15 years now. But oddly enough, I'd never had an opportunity to really engage with Taiwan and really more deeply also have an opportunity to think about the role of Taiwan. And that's why I applied in the first place, because with all the turning points in history that had been happening in recent times, the Russian aggression war of aggression, but also a new government in Germany, new thinking, strategic thinking by the German government on mainland China with the China strategy, which was introduced in July 2023, and a general shift in Europe towards a little bit more an inward-looking and perhaps a little bit more confident approach towards European security policy, perhaps also helped through the Trump 2 administration currently, that I just really wanted to get a better grasp of what the current status quo is and where we can then also go with Taiwan in the future. In general, just for general impressions, what I appreciated about the program as well was that, we did not just talk business, we did not just talk policy. I really appreciated also the insights into civil society actors. I liked that we really had an impression of what makes Taiwan tick, and also the opportunity to kind of have a view into the not so beautiful parts of Taiwan and maybe also the contentious parts of it, and also the sense that not everything is great and working without problems as in any place on the world. And I think that was very refreshing and much appreciated. And I think it also, professionalized my, view on Taiwan and its place in the world. So just for that, thank you once again for choosing me for the program. When I think about Taiwan, or when I thought about Taiwan in January, maybe before I joined the program, I, of course, was most familiar with the mainland Chinese perspective of Taiwan, which, to be honest, it wasn't really much of a topic of discussion. There's, since I have a focus on the economic relationship between Germany and China, business, is straightforward. It's about making money. It's about, increasing profit margins. And so there's a lot of, just common sense policies where it's almost, Taiwan and the Taiwan issue is, an afterthought, if that at all. Now, after returning from Taiwan, I can tell you as well, the current new German government is currently in a plan of kind of revising the China strategy and is also working on a national economic security strategy. And when I think about Taiwan, I think about Taiwan in terms of economic security. Johanna has already mentioned TSMC, and she said all the right things about it, and I totally share her viewpoints on it anyway. But what's most important is that I think the role that Taiwan will continue to play, and I quite like what Johanna said as well about maintaining the island as it is, not just for its companies, but just as it works as a system and as it, what it represents, is something that we should really also as Europeans safeguard. So Taiwan has, over the last decades, maintained and kind of established a certain place. It has established, of course, now an important role in the semiconductor industry, but Taiwan is so much more. And also, I personally also believe in symbolism, and I also believe in what what Taiwan represents in the grander scheme of, geopolitics as well. And I clearly see a role for Taiwan as well there. Which is why also, my paper as part of the compendium was kind of making the case that Taiwan is a very logical case for economic security for Germans and also for Europeans. What does that mean? It basically means that yes, maybe the one China policy should not be adjusted or will not be adjusted. But what should be adjusted is, of course, that we can make a very clear case that Germany has clear economic interests. Germany is one of the third largest trading partners of Taiwan. That we should do anything we can to maintain the status quo. And how can we do that as well? Quite frankly, by also, very clearly enshrining the importance of Taiwan as an interest, an economic interest for Europe and Germany in policy language, and making it very explicit, not just implicit. Because if you currently look at policy papers or strategies by the German government, for example, it's very wishy-washy. It's just acknowledging that Taiwan is there, but there's no real commitment or any other way of kind of safeguarding Taiwanese interests, or why we even should safeguard Taiwanese interests. And with that also in mind, we have to keep in mind as well, with the shifting dynamic currently happening in the United States, and where it is a little bit unclear where the United States currently stands, on kind of continue to safeguard, Taiwanese interests. I kind of also want to see that, now is the time for European confidence as well as a regional actor and as a global actor. So, I'm trying to stay positive and be optimistic as well in terms of all the shifts that are currently happening, all the things that we're currently questioning about what we used to take for granted in terms of security dynamics, in terms of global stability, that maybe there's also an inherent value for Europeans to kind of see, okay, where can we actually factor into this? And so apart from the fact that, yes, you can use more explicit language to safeguard Taiwanese interests on a European scale, but of course, there's so many opportunities for cooperation as well, be it cybersecurity, be it maritime security, be it, just knowledge exchange programs, which, could be just driven up in general much more than they are currently happening. You have a lot of cooperations between the UK and Canada and Taiwan, but why are there not more European actors involved in it? It's all very timid, I would say. And I think maybe now the time has come to be a little bit less timid when it comes to a general approach towards Taiwan. And this is also basically the case that I'm making. Just now the German government is starting on its economic security strategy, and that's basically what I'm going to be taking very directly from TUPP towards my work to kind of make the case of why it makes sense now that, especially with TSMC, Dresden will soon be home to a TSMC fab, which of course puts us, and by us I mean Germany, on the semiconductor supply chain. And that has very real economic security implications that we just need to be aware of. At the same time, Taiwan is increasing its investments into the state of Saxony, where Dresden is located. So there is a clear move towards, on the one hand, Taiwan and TSMC realizing the diversification of the supply chains as a strategic approach that makes sense, but we kind of have to also think of what is our response to that. We can't just, open our doors and then see what happens. We have to think strategically about what those kind of investments actually mean in the long term for our relationship with, other partners, but also, with, countries like mainland China, and what kind of implications that could carry if, in the worst case scenario, something bad is going to be happening and tensions would be escalating. So, basically to kind of openly address the fact that, we are cooperating more, and then we kind of also need to develop a strategy to what that cooperation on also European terms, because, Germany and Europe are not always the best about defining what their national interests are and also what their national security interests are. And I think also Taiwan is giving us an opportunity to kind of push us towards thinking very clearly about, okay, so how do we actually navigate those very fraught waters, and where do we position ourselves on that? So in that sense, it's very welcome, and the initiative and the push from Taiwan that is happening is very welcome, but we just need to make sure that we make the most of it, and that we also ensure that we are actually having smart policy answers to that as well. And then that's basically also why Germany-Taiwan is not just a German-Taiwanese issue or opportunity, it's also a pan-European issue or an opportunity that would also necessitate more coordination, of course, between the European partners when it comes to that as well. And I think I'm just hitting the mark. So I'll go back to Ben and Bonnie.
Thank you, Thomas. That's fantastic. So I want to remind our listeners and viewers, if you would like to send in your questions, you can either send an email to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or you can send them in to X or Twitter at globaltaiwan.org. And we'll be taking questions in a little while. We have, I think, almost 40 minutes left. And so I'm going to ask a few questions to our speakers, and then Ben's going to pose a few questions, and then we will take some questions if you want to send them in. So I want to start by asking a question about how the transatlantic relationship can better support Taiwan. The United States, of course, has worked with Taiwan a very long time and in many, many different ways. But one of the ways in which we work with other countries, including Europe, is the Global Cooperation Training Framework, GCTF. And that includes running workshops with officials from different countries, and that it really enables Taiwan to share some of its expertise with the rest of the world. And that's actually a program that's run by the American Institute of Taiwan, now in collaboration with Canada, with Japan, and with Australia. The European Union is not yet a member. Maybe it will be, but we have co-sponsored some of the workshops with the EU. But I'd really like to ask if you would like to give us some of your suggestions on where the greatest opportunities are for the US and Europe to work together in support of Taiwan. So who would like to share their thoughts?
I'll start.
Great.
I raised my hand, but I don't know if it popped up. I don't know. Well, like I mentioned, cybersecurity is, of course, also an issue where I think, because I'm also thinking about the transatlantic relationship as well. And, currently you could make the argument that, of course, the transatlantic relationship, Germany, US, is also, a little bit fraught. And I think cybersecurity issues are that one area where I would really see a great foundation for continued cooperation between the agencies of the US and Europe, in that case, to kind of cooperate, which would ultimately also benefit, of course, Taiwan. Because I think those are, cybersecurity is one of those issues where I think we are all in agreement that we need to do more work on. And I think that we have, identified vulnerabilities, but I think more coordination is something that even probably the Trump 2 administration could go on board with. So I think that would be one of those mutually beneficial areas of interest to throw one of them out there into the group.
Great, terrific. Other thoughts? Yes, Johanna.
Yeah, I also would just point out, we heard from one of our interlocutors in the public sector about the possibility of a kind of AI knowledge sharing working group on regulation between like small and medium-sized countries and Taiwan. So certain European partners would fit in there, but I was also thinking about the potential of subnational level engagement from the US, possibly having one or two or three of the states that are leading when it comes to AI regulation, but also maybe taking divergent approaches and just having a knowledge sharing workshop in Taiwan to also maybe encourage Taiwan, which is such a strong leader in hardware, to take a leading role in Asia on AI regulation as well.
Great, wonderful, great ideas. Anyone else?
It just
Kayla?
Kayla, yeah.
I was going to say, I was going to jump in a little bit on Thomas's really great point, and just say that it is interesting. I think cybersecurity is a very interesting area. And if you look at also the South Korea perspective, I know we're talking transatlantic, but if you think about kind of the partnership triangles and dynamics, Korea also faces quite a concerning threat from North Korea. And I wonder if there's more opportunities to share in the cybersecurity, especially as we're seeing North Korea developing this and really expanding its asymmetric power in this space. And so obviously we have South Korea and the US working together very collaboratively. And I know that there are some conversations, maybe less in the public sphere and less in the front ground between South Korea and Taiwan. But I also wonder if there's another way of bringing in more middle power leadership from Northeast Asia into these conversations with US and transatlantic. So I wanted to piggyback on Thomas's point because I think it's an excellent one.
Thomas, did you have something else you'd like to share as well?
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you, Kayla. But also, I just wanted to mention as well, because maybe there won't be another opportunity for that as well. The business communities. I think there's also a huge opportunity for the German business communities, the American business communities, the Japanese business community, the Korean business communities to really do a lot of knowledge sharing as well. Because we're always talking on a policy level, and I mean, Johanna also mentioned the subnational level. But let's think about the people who are also, actually doing the business that is, keeping basically the supply chains running, because there is not enough exchange as it currently is. Everyone's doing a little bit of their own thing. Some of them are doing, the simulations of what happens in the worst case, but there's not really a lot of proactive and also a positive, kind of collaboration for kind of learning from each other on how to best tackle those issues. So I'm really just encouraging the businesses, because I think, at least on a German perspective, there is a huge willingness for knowledge sharing, and I think we should really bank on that. And I think as well, this is one of the ways where also American business leaders would probably also be very interested in that, even though markets are different and demands are different. But I think this is something that we should really not forget.
Great, terrific. I'll move on to another question. I think that we, of course, focus always on what governments should do with Taiwan, but we don't talk very much about what maybe think tanks can do, or civil society with Taiwan, and emerging policy leaders like yourselves. So after your experiences in Taiwan, wondering if you have some thoughts on how you and others like you, those who've either joined TUPP, may join TUPP in the future, or those who are engaging with Taiwan through other means, how can people like yourselves contribute to deepening engagement with Taiwan? So who would like to share some thoughts there? Great, Julia.
Yes, I think that's quite an important point, especially given the diplomatic limitations that Taiwan has at this point in time to engage in global forums with other governments when it comes to knowledge exchange, either within policy or any other domains. Think tanks can play quite a pivotal role in being those bridge builders between European countries and also in the US and Taiwan for knowledge exchange, as think tanks are naturally doing quite a lot of both their own research and engagement with policymakers. They really stand at that ideal intersection point where they can both exchange knowledge with Taiwan, but also introduce what Taiwan can bring to the policymakers locally where they're working. So that's something that I've been thinking quite a lot about after we visited Taiwan, and really trying to engage in the networks that I have established to understand how we can build those bridges and start the dialogue for knowledge exchange.
Wonderful. That's terrific. Anyone else? Tomas, yes, and I, of course, meant to include the business communities.
No, that's totally fine. I was actually going to say, because me wearing my Technical University of Berlin hat, of course, when you talk about science cooperation and also, education cooperation in any way, because, in my classes, usually they're all engineers, very keen, for example, on working with Taiwan or working for Taiwan or working for TSMC in that case. So, like there's also, of course, a huge opportunity as well to kind of build bridges through education, through science, through, I think ultimately very positive and lofty goals in terms of just increasing overall quality of life on this planet. And I think universities are a wonderful avenue for exploring exactly that. And, there are corporations, and Bonnie, I don't know if you remember, but when we were at TSMC, I used that opportunity to kind of make the case. And, I have been in touch with the TSMC people as well to kind of really establish a more formalized approach of cooperation between TSMC and the Technical University of Berlin. So that's what we're currently working on as well. And I think that's one of the avenues that will also use one of our greatest resources, young people and young minds, to kind of, bridge any of those contentious issues that we are currently living through.
That's great. That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that you are in touch with TSMC and promoting cooperation and collaboration. I think that they're really interested in building their networks in Europe, as well as, of course, in the United States. Anyone else? Yes, Johanna.
Just in a small nod to the depth and breadth of the TUPP program, I might recommend that for every conversation people like us have about either the security dilemma of Taiwan or TSMC, we also add in one or two other cultural elements or takeaways that are from, either university exchanges or societal activities that has nothing to do with those two very, very headline dominant subjects. Bonnie mentioned the food, and I think that's a really great place to start. So, small tip.
Well, that's wonderful. We did, of course, visit Taiwan's legislature. We met with the opposition parties. We went to a museum to do a deep dive into Taiwan's history and visited some of the areas in Tainan where, of course, the Dutch landed when they had a short stint in ruling parts of Taiwan. So it was, yes, it is a very comprehensive program. I want to throw in a bit of a maybe surprise question and ask you all if there's one thing that you experienced in the program or that you learned that really surprised you, something that you didn't expect, that was or something that left the deepest impression, one or the other, either something that surprised you or something that really left the deepest impression on you from your trip. And we spent, by the way, 8 days in Taiwan, and we were in Taipei and also went to Tainan as well as Hsinchu, of course, where we did visit TSMC. So who would like to share? Ooh, 2 hands at once. Okay. All right, Kayla, you go first.
Kayla first, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think for what really stuck out, so I'll talk about what actually kind of stayed with me. And you had mentioned us being down in Tainan and being at the museum and hearing the narrative of what Taiwan kind of sees itself as and where its story begins and ends. And it comes back to a couple of points. And I was thinking one of the best parts about TUPP and about either next gen or mid-career engagement is linking up networks. And you do that when you meet people and you have opportunities for people to people engagement. So I'm not necessarily talking kind of tourism in that sense, but I'm thinking more of when you bridge that connection between communities. And so one of the things that has stuck with me is that Taiwan's history and its culture and how it sees itself, I think, is much more embedded in the international space than oftentimes those of us who are outside of Taiwan think about Taiwan. So I think we'll often think about it being very much locked into the Indo-Pacific context and a Northeast Asia context. And we don't think about all of the layers of history. So you mentioned the Dutch, obviously Portugal, Japan, and there's a lot of layering there. And at least when we were in Tainan, we heard that layering came forward. So that wasn't just, Taiwan has a connectivity to the international scene and the national globe in the past, but that is what we also are still today. And I think it was that international historical perspective leaning into today, thinking about Taiwan within an international community that's not stuck in the region, but as the point of TUPP's goal is so that there's different regional connections. I think Taiwan also articulates that story and that narrative and that self-perspective very well. And that was something that I hadn't quite put in that frame of reference before I was on the ground talking to the people and engaging. And then afterwards, it still sticks with me. And I think that's why I constantly am saying, I bring up Taiwan in a lot of conversations. I'm like, we should talk more about this. We should find the connection. There's opportunities here. We can learn, we can share. And I think that's something that obviously will play forward because of that network connection and that people-to-people engagement.
I like that. Tomas?
Well, Bonnie, you forgot to mention that we drank a lot of boba as well and really enjoyed it as well. And there's actually like a boba place not far from my apartment here in Berlin, which is run by a family from Tainan, of all places. So it's really fun. And just in terms of one anecdote that really stuck with me is those who were on the trip will remember when we went to one of the beaches in Tainan. And I took a little bit of a stroll before the rest of the group joined me again to take some pictures. And while I was there walking towards basically the sea on one of those dams that they had constructed there was a group of young people who were taking pictures, and they were asking me if I could take a picture from them. And what was really interesting to me was that there were 3 Taiwanese young people and 1 girl who was visiting from Fuzhou, from mainland China. And they were hanging out and taking pictures and having a good time with each other. And I was speaking with them in Mandarin, and we were just joking and everything. But that kind of stuck with me because I was very surprised that that was even possible. That was one of those moments where then later on the cohort joined me, and I've been thinking about that moment for a long time now because also in the spirit of cross-strait understanding and people just talking to each other, it was encouraging, at least. And so that was one of the things that actually stuck with me, this very chance meeting on one of the beaches in Tainan.
That's great that you shared that, Tomas. I think everywhere in the world there should be more relationships, but just built among people from everywhere, and it does help, I think, in creating a little bit more understanding about our different societies, and the societies in mainland China and Taiwan are really quite different. And so it is really useful for people to go over and experience the other side. Julia?
Yeah, I think you're right. They are quite different societies, and I think that's something that I didn't quite realize before coming to Taiwan, just how different. And also what stayed with me is this incredible ability to keep things in balance. I think it's just because Taiwan had to deal with the issues of trying to kind of protect their own identity and build it, but at the same time to try to not escalate the situation and keep peace and maintain the status quo. So a lot of people are both simultaneously are very open to dialogue and very open-minded and quite ready to discuss very different perspectives, but also are very pragmatic when it comes to dangers that they're facing and what could potentially happen and what it could mean for them and for their country. And that's quite an incredible skill to have in day-to-day life, to be able to be both open and also incredibly pragmatic. So that's something that stayed with me for quite a long time, and I think that's not something that I was expecting to discover in Taiwan.
Great, Joanna?
Yeah, so in the China policy world, I think we're constantly repeating that China is not a monolith, and there's a variety of opinions within China about various policy issues. And you would think that that would be taken for granted in the Taiwan case, given that it's a democracy, but I do think there is a simplification of the Taiwanese perspective or what Taiwan thinks about certain issues, especially ones as existential as the relationship with China. And to Thomas's point, I think there actually is quite a lot of diversity on how that issue is viewed and also how exchanges with China can or should occur. We were able to see an example, a really close-up case study of diversity of opinion when we were speaking with legislators who had some strong difference of opinion. They were very candid, but also we were able to kind of get a broader societal look at that from the NGOs that we met with who monitor online discussion, as well as disinformation and misinformation in Taiwanese cyberspace. But they've got a clear sense of what the very varied camps are in Taiwan when it comes to cross-strait relations. And that is just something that I think often gets a bit erased in the coverage of Taiwan here in the States, even if you're following it quite closely. So that was a strong takeaway for me. It was just the internal diversity of thought on that issue.
Yeah, great point. Thank you for making it. So my last question before I turn to Ben for his questions, and hopefully some of you who are watching have sent in some questions, and if you haven't, please do. So my last question is, how has your experience in Taiwan through your participation in TUPP really shaped your understanding of Taiwan's role in the international system, especially as it relates to your own areas of expertise? So who would like to start on that? All right, Tomas. You're muted.
Beginner's mistake. Sorry, my first video conference. Just to reiterate the point that I made during my remarks, I think TUPP has kind of firmly established Taiwan as a significant player. And as it is, which is why maintaining the status quo is so important. I didn't know much about basically Taiwan's policies, politics, personal view, et cetera, and through TUPP I've kind of now understood that it's an undeniable part of the global community, and that it needs to be taken seriously and seriously considered. Also when it comes to policy decisions, to policy making, and quite frankly also to future strategies of certain businesses and certain industries, and should like I said as well in my remarks, it should be part of industrial policy thinking in terms of Europe, but also in terms of the United States and the rest of the world.
Great. Anyone else? Yes, Julia.
I quite agree with Thomas on that. I think I didn't quite have the same level of understanding to which extent we need to be thinking about Taiwan as a part of industrial strategy here in Europe, and also what type of role it plays for supply chains, not just when it comes to semiconductors, but also the importance of the strait and the maritime trade, and also what Ireland represents as a whole, especially within the AI space. Obviously, with advanced semiconductors, Taiwan is pretty much a core for developing that technology. So yeah, the importance of it cannot be understated.
Yes, absolutely true. Kayla.
Yes, and I'm coming back to the point about the international and thinking more of the supply chain dynamics. I think that was one of the things that I took away from the time on the ground, the conversations. There was so many other spaces. I mean, obviously TSMC, big name in the room, main focus. The question is, can that model be used other places? It's kind of the comparative to everything. Even recently when I was in Korea and Gyeongju talking for civil nuclear energy, they were talking about how do they take a TSMC model for building nuclear reactor parts in South Korea. So it's a model concept that is very internationalized and focused on. But what was very exciting, this goes back to the remarks I gave, is that there are all these other industry sectors and these other opportunities for economic growth and collaboration, obviously competition, but also potentially cooperation. And we think about the global supply chain dynamics, that should be a space that Taiwan is playing in and supporting. And that I think there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration beyond what we normally think about. So I think that was why I had so much fun writing the space paper. I know it's a bit out there, a little bit different, but it was exciting because there is an opportunity. And I think that energy and that motivation, that opportunity was very much felt in a lot of the conversations we had across a variety of sectors. So it wasn't just semiconductors, it's civil nuclear, it's space technology. So I think that's one of the key things I took away.
Wonderful. Johanna?
Yeah, for me, the transatlantic element was really helpful in thinking about how to possibly right-size United States-China policy. Thomas has this great sentence in his article that everybody should read, hot off the presses, in his TUPP Compendium article, that says, surely such an important element as economic security relations with Taiwan and Germany, that such an important discussion here merits more than one line, one throwaway line in a policy document or some such. And that just immediately had me thinking, yeah, but we in the US, we take Taiwan, and we write a lot of possible bills and laws and proposals and opinions about it as a central tenet of China policy. And I think that constant, stubborn overlap or intertwined nature of the policies might be a little bit to the detriment, especially of the economic and technological cooperation that could be happening, both with Taiwan and the U.S. And maybe if we see Europe strengthen up its focus a little bit, then we could see a better outcome with Europe and Taiwan in terms of cooperation there.
Great. All terrific inputs. Thank you. Ben, you have more questions to pose, so over to you.
Yeah, I'll just start with one question before moving on to some of our audience questions. So Taiwan faces constant challenges from authoritarian actors ranging from disinformation to economic coercion. So based on your research or experience, kind of what strategies can Taiwan adopt to bolster resilience while maintaining openness? Sure, Julia.
I think one thing that I reflected on previously, one of the key advantages that Taiwan has, especially when it comes to dealing with disinformation and misinformation and digital space, is their rapid responses and their agility. But when it comes to regulatory frameworks and governance frameworks for digital infrastructure and for things like AI systems that are being integrated into the public institutions and into the fabric of daily life, it's still Taiwan is still developing its own framework for governing those emerging technologies. Thinking a little bit more about governance as a security mechanism is probably one strategy that I would reflect on, because we can think about governance and setting rules for something as an impediment, and that's very often, if we're thinking from business perspective, that could be the case. But especially for digital threats, gray zone attacks, and hybrid attacks, a lot of those are digitally enabled or AI enabled, and that's where robust governance mechanisms can serve as a security measure. So.
Yeah, Kayla.
I know that we talked a lot on the ground about thinking about resiliency as also including the public in general. But I think for kind of adding to Julia's point, I think there's also a large opportunity and also necessity for Taiwan to maintain diplomatic engagement where it can within the spaces that it can, and trying to expand and grow that in the cooperative environment. So that was some of my thinking when we were looking at what role do these kind of large international summits or meetings. I mean, we could be a little flippant and say it's just a summit, it's a handshake, it's a photo, but it does matter to be included in the room and in conversations as much as possible. And maintaining that diplomatic engagement is quite important. So I think APEC is going to be a very interesting example. It's a place that Taiwan has already played a very key role when looking at digital economy in the past. And I think they will continue to play and put out large platforms to bring other coalitions together and bring other nations to focus on specific needs such as AI. But I think in particular, we have a tendency maybe to think about it as resiliency as maybe being a kind of economic or immediate and cross-strait scenarios that require some type of contingency planning. But I think resiliency also is in maintaining a community of diplomatic engagement with core nations that also see the value in that partnership. And so obviously that can exist between US, Taiwan, that can be Europe, Taiwan, that can be Japan, that can be South Korea. But that also plays into, I think, a larger picture about strategic resiliency as well.
Thank you so much, Kayla. So question from our audience, specifically for Thomas. So what role can Germany play in providing security support for Taiwan? For example, arms sales and not just diplomatic and economic support.
That's a very good question. Again, I don't speak on behalf of the German government. I think that's important to reiterate. But in terms of actual, defense and security measures, I don't actually currently see Germany being the best place to do it, simply because of domestic politics in Germany currently. Because, we are currently in a crisis of indecisiveness, and, we have the economy to worry about, et cetera, et cetera. Not that that justifies inaction, but just to be blunt, I think currently Germany has other issues that are more pressing in the perception of the German policymaking sphere. So I think that would be a medium-term kind of consideration, or kind of depending on what will ultimately end up in the in the economic security document that I talked about. But if you ask me about right now, Germany could not provide any, or will not provide any sort of, anything else in addition to what it's currently doing. But that is certainly something that would be part of the discussion concerning economic security in the coming months. But we'll see.
All right, thank you so much. On to the next question. So within each of your respective regions of expertise, what are the most prominent barriers to further supporting Taiwan? Despite the hesitancy to support Taiwan because of strategic ambiguity, what changes do you predict or hope to see in the near future with the US and Europe?
I mean, I'm happy to start. Basically my field of work, and again, I of course have an understanding and appreciation as well for the mainland Chinese perspective, and it is a balancing act, and it's a very sensitive balancing act, and I think that's also, of course, just that doesn't make it much easier. But I think ultimately, like I said in my remarks in the beginning, we can like a concrete thing that we can start doing as Europeans is, to dedicate more than half a sentence to Taiwan and its importance and its strategic importance, which, trusting that those documents will be read by all sides. And kind of not inserting us unnecessarily into an ongoing debate, but just also kind of showing that this is basically how a geopolitically complex world works, with very complex trade routes and the very complex dependencies. That we are also part of it, and that we have interests as well that need to be protected and safeguarded. And so that's why I'm saying we're coming from the place of, or we should be coming from the place of marking our own interests and kind of highlighting that and not being afraid to show those, and then also letting all other sides also draw their own conclusions from that. And I think one of the first steps that you can do is just be a little bit more concrete, or way more concrete in terms of what the implications are for a deterioration of the cross-strait relations, and what that would mean, and why it's important to safeguard those, without involving us much deeper into ultimately the dynamic between mainland China and Taiwan. It's more of a thing of thinking about how does this affect us, and how can we safeguard our interests in that case.
If I can jump in.
Yeah, sure.
One thing I would emphasize quickly is just from the US side, the business and tech community, they pretty clearly have President Trump's ear, for better or worse. So I think they could probably do some good in explaining to him some of the unique conditions in Taiwan's ecosystem and supply chain, and also just really emphasizing the importance of Taiwan right now. That comes to mind.
Oh yeah, Julia, and then Kayla.
I agree with both Thomas and Johanna. I think being able to translate to policymakers exactly how important Taiwan is, especially in Europe, there is not quite a lot of understanding among policymakers on the EU level, but also on national level, as to what Taiwan means for our own economic security, and also how extensive the impact is going to be if the cross-strait relations are to deteriorate. Just being able to get that understanding and starting the dialogue is probably going to be quite important going forwards, and I'm hoping to be able to play my role in that, but also I'm hoping to see it developing and that discussion maturing a little bit more in the European space.
All right, Kayla.
Yes, and I think if we're talking, obviously from my background is going to be more on the US and South Korea and thinking more that alliance structure and what happens in contingency planning when thinking about this in the Taiwan context. And I think it's been a very careful line to walk for Korea. We have heard in more recent years, particularly retired politicians and military leaders speaking up more loudly than previously and saying that South Korea would support Taiwan in a contingency and that the South Korean military should be ready to support. So it's not just a diplomatic conversation, but it's also thinking strategically about where U.S. force posture is in the region, how we can rely on our allies that are closer, should that need to be a situation. I think, unfortunately, as we've all mentioned, it's a very sensitive topic. It's a fine line that has to be walked in thinking about how far can support go. And if we're thinking about the barriers for Korea to maybe articulate further or to find a stance that's a bit stronger, really the concern is that if there's a Taiwan contingency, how quickly would a North Korea contingency follow? So what would be happening on the Korean Peninsula? Would there be a moment of like an opportunistic advancement, and thinking through where do troop presence need to be for Korea's own national security interests, not just in Taiwan's context. And so I think it has been more at the forefront in the past few years. We'll see what this presidency in South Korea will think about this, especially if they're leaning more into economic relationships with mainland China. Does that still leave open the consideration for the security dynamics and the what if scenarios in a Taiwan context? And there are some that will be pushing that, and there will be maybe others that won't. And so it depends a little bit on the military as well as defense leadership, and some of the individuals who have the ear of the presidency. But I think it's an interesting conversation that will continue to play out, though I think it's a little hard to gain clarity on the military side and have a very clear articulation of that, just because it is so murky and the concerns of what would happen for spillover effects on the Korean Peninsula. So it's a tricky question, but I think it's interesting to see Korea talking more openly about it.
All right, thank you so much. So we just have two more questions before we end today. So for Kayla, as you're looking forward towards APEC, what do you consider the best case scenario for Taiwan and APEC? And can you talk a little bit more about specific programs or partners that you hope will be strengthened through APEC?
Yes, happy to do so. So right now I'm tracking a couple of different situations. So as we know, APEC, we talk about the big leaders summit. That's the big one that you'll see in the news, and that will be later in October, early November. But obviously there are a series of meetings that lead up to this as well. So we have the energy ministerial. We also have a specific meeting talking on AI policy. This is going to be a really big platform that's going to be pushed forward. South Korea was already trying to take a lead in the diplomatic discussions of AI policy, even if they're not taking the technical lead in that sense, but they've tried to position themselves as a platform to discuss AI policy, and that was the previous government, so we'll see what this current government is looking into a bit more. But for Taiwan, I think one of the biggest wins or the biggest takeaway would be is to have a seat at the table, to be in the room, to be on the stage, to be included in these environments. And as I said before, it can seem very symbolic, and it can seem that it's a one and done photo, handshake, the news kind of reports it, but it's the conversations that happen around that and the recognition of Taiwan's leadership and some of these sectors that I mentioned. So AI policy, digital economy has been one area that many people have said that Taiwan has punched well above its weight, not only domestically, but internationally within the region, within Southeast Asia as well. And so I think those are going to be some of the areas I'm tracking specifically for the lead up to the Leaders Summit. The other one that I think will be very interesting is Korea's being quite bold in this idea of creating a CEO leaders meeting as well. And so there will be a CEO level industry relations meeting, and they're talking as high as 300, 400 CEO or business leaders that are going to be convening from around the world in South Korea to speak. And I think this will be a really interesting opportunity to showcase industry talent and to really bring in that industry voice into the conversation. So you're not just having a diplomatic handshake, but you're also having sector to sector engagement and conversation in those spaces as well. And I'm curious to hear if Taiwan will be participating or having some of its own CEO cooperation in that sector beyond just also having a representative in South Korea. So those are some of the things that I'm tracking in particular.
All right, thank you so much, Kayla. So we're almost at time. So Bonnie, if you want to give some closing remarks.
Yes, I want to thank all of our fantastic speakers for sharing their thoughts today. It was really a great event. And I want to thank those who have tuned in to listen. And for anybody who is interested in applying to the TUPP program for 2026. Around October 1st, we will open up the application process on the German Marshall Fund website. The program is open to young professionals ages 29 to 43. And we particularly read very closely people's essays, short, only a couple of paragraphs, about how they could bring Taiwan into their work going forward, because that really is the objective of the TUPP program. I want to thank again our funders of TUPP, and that is the Global Taiwan Institute, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. You can find the compendium of papers written by all of the 10 participants from the 2025 program on the GMF website. It's called Next Generation Perspectives on Taiwan. And again, the 2025 cohort, which is the 7th iteration of TUPP. So once again, thanks to all of you for joining the program and for joining us today. And I wish you all a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
All right, we're off. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
With pleasure.
Thank you.